The title of my talk is How Islamic is the Islamic Republic, and more precisely I will talk about a certain notion in Islamic law that I think is very useful to understand in order to sort of get a grasp at how the Islamic Republic has transformed itself over the last 30 years. And I'm sure that many of you have been glued to the TV this summer when you saw the rather violent demonstrations or the violent suppression of the demonstrations that that occurred in the aftermath of the presidential elections. President Ahmadinejad was re-elected, or at least it was proclaimed that he had been re-elected. Many Iranians doubt that he had been the truthful victor in those elections and felt that the elections had actually been stolen. Many Iranians speak of a coup. And I often get questions from those interested in Iranian politics about how it is possible that on the one hand one sees so much contestation and so much resistance often on the Iranian streets. We also know that the Iranian population is one of the most educated in the Middle East. And at the same time, we know that the regime in many ways, through the legal regime that it has created after the Islamic Revolution, has a very repressive and socially very conservative, politically also very conservative values that are sort of being imposed from above. So I'm trying to shed some light today on how it is possible that on the one hand you find quite a high degree of contestation and participation in the Islamic Republic, but then at the same time also a whole apparatus in which those that don't disagree, or that do disagree, do not agree with the Islamic orthodoxy as it is imposed from above, how those are being dealt with by the regime. So it is very much sort of an analysis of how the regime structures the participation of its citizens and at the same time how it also controls them. And to somehow foreshadow a little bit, I think the thought that I would close with is if you look at other political regimes in the Middle East, you often find that they have a huge bureaucracy of control, right? Especially in Syria, to some extent in Lebanon, in Egypt, a very large bureaucracy through which the state surveys its own citizens. In Iran, you don't really find something comparable, not comparable to Syria, but at the same time, you find that the regime much more employs the law in order to control its citizens. And that is something that I want to shed light on today. So I hope that some of you are interested in law. I hope there are lawyers in the room, because we will talk a lot about the Constitution today and how this experiment has been undertaken in Iran to Islamicize an entire legal system, right? And we can imagine that it is very, very difficult to do. Under the Pahlavi regime prior to the revolution, 1979, the legal system was predominantly secular. You had sort of pockets of law that were Islamicized, such as in many Muslim countries today. Family code is often Islamicized. There are references to Sharia in order to justify certain custody and divorce regulations that are thought to be more in the tradition of Islamic law than secular law. So that was quite normal, that one would see these pockets of Islamic law also before the revolution. But after the revolution in 1979, you have to imagine that the political elites tried to Islamicize an entire legal system. That means you have to rewrite the penal code, the civil law. You have to retrain judges entirely that have been trained in the pre-revolutionary legal system in order to make them fit to be adjudicators and judges and lawyers in the new legal system. So it's a rather large project of political and legal engineering that produces many challenges and that I would say also has in many ways been rather unsuccessful. So what we will do, we will look first a little bit at the Constitution and the contradictions that it bears in order to understand how it can be that on the one hand you have relatively, I wouldn't say free, but certainly elections that are highly contested, much more contested than what we would find in Egypt, or even Kuwait. Egypt and Kuwait belong to the more contested elections in the Middle East, but many would argue that in Iran we actually find the highest degree of contestation. But at the same time, we also know that elections don't matter that much in determining who has political power. And to sort of understand that more closely, we will look at the at the Constitution first, and then later I will give you a larger overview over the nature of the political system. So, I wonder whether we can, we should be able to, yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, so I have to step back myself a little bit, or I can look here. So, very quickly put, of course, normally we think of the Islamic Republic as a theocratic regime. Why? Because the highest political authority is supposed to be also the highest theological authority in the country. The highest Shiite jurist is the one that also at the same time is positioned in the highest political authority. So theoretically there is supposed to be this merger of theological and political authority, although after 1989, after Khomeini died, that is no longer the case, and I will tell you in a moment why. And also, all law should cohere, theoretically speaking, with religious law, however this is defined by the authorized political religious institutions. So we find that the Constitution imposes on the legislators, on the parliament, that all laws must be based on Islamic criteria, that the Islamic Consultative Assembly, that is the parliament itself, that the parliament cannot enact laws against Islamic principles, that a certain council that is staffed of 12 clerics, 6 of which are trained in Islamic law and 6 of which do not necessarily have to be trained in Islamic law, that this council establishes by majority vote whether or not the legislation passed by the parliament is in conformity with the precepts of Islam. Then there's another article that says if a judge has to decide over a case where there is an absence of codified law, in other words, when he's confronted with a case where he really can't find regulations in the existing law on how to adjudicate this case, then he can also refer to contemporary fatwas. And finally, there's the article in the Constitution, that's the last article, that the Islamic nature of the system cannot be amended or changed according to the Constitution. Now, you may remember that in 1997, a rather reformist president was elected in Iran, right? President Khatami. And here in the West, we became aware of him first, or many became aware of him through the interview on CNN with Christian Amanpour, where he sort of presented a rather conciliar standpoint. He tacitly hinted at the fact that he would support if the United States and Iran were thinking about not re-establishing diplomatic relations, but at least taking steps that could at some point lead towards renewed diplomatic relations. He also said that Iran would accept the will of the Palestinian people if there were a vote for a two-state solution, for example. So in terms of his foreign policy, many perceived him to be much, much more pragmatically minded than previous presidents. But also, perhaps more importantly, within the country, he pushed a heavy reform agenda. So even though this constitution says you can't really change the Islamic character of the constitution, he tried to strengthen civil society. His ministers issued many, many new newspaper licenses that put much more sort of, at least that monitored the behavior of political elites more closely and uncovered corruption cases and so on. He also supported the formation of political parties. So he took a number of steps that tried to strengthen political liberalization in Iran. And he tried to do it within the confines of the constitution. The reformists at that time still thought that even though this constitution is an Islamic constitution, that you can somehow democratize it from within. And I would argue that today, that spirit is no longer there among many opposition figures in Iran. I think that this period of the Khatami administration that was between 1997 and 2005, just before Ahmadinejad was elected, that spirit of believing that you can somehow democratize Iran while still retaining this constitution was possible, that belief is no longer there. And I think if we look at the sort of banners and demonstrations that we have seen this summer on TV, the Green Wave, as it is called, against Ahmadinejad, that many there argue for a de facto secularization of the regime if it is to be democratized. In other words, democratization cannot take place within the framework of this current constitution, is what many political elites believe today. one of the most important contradictions in this constitution, and I should preface this by pointing our attention to the fact that the 1979 constitution was actually based on the French 1959 constitution, which of course is a secular constitution. So the constitution of the Fifth French Republic was used by Khomeini and the Constitution Drafting Committee in order to develop a constitution for what they envisioned to be a theocratic state. And that is very interesting, right? Because one wonders, what does it take to take a secular constitution and somehow change it in a way that it can become the basis for an Islamic republic? And what this has resulted in, that you see on one hand that freedom of speech is granted, that freedom of assembly, all these civil liberties that political scientists consider to be absolutely fundamental to democratic politics, all of those rights are actually there in the Islamic constitution. But crucially, each of these constitutional parameters ends with a clause that says according to Islamic principles. So for example, you will find citizens have the right to freedom of assembly, but then at the end of that clause it will state according to Islamic principles. And similarly with the freedom of assembly and other civil liberties. And that, of course, because what Islamic principles means is very much open to contestation, and there's much disagreement among religious authorities what that means. Because of this ambiguity, these civil liberties can be curtailed through the judiciary. So we find it very interesting tension here in the Constitution between popular sovereignty, and of course that is still the remnant of the French 1959 Constitution, that was a constitution based on popular sovereignty, the will of the people, on one hand, but the Iranian element that was then added to it, which is sovereignty of the supreme leader, the highest theological authority. So one article states, absolute sovereignty over the world and man belongs to God, and it is he who has made man master of his own social destiny. No one can deprive man of this divine right, nor subordinate it to the vested interest of a particular individual or group. The people are to exercise this divine right in the manner specified in the following articles. So it's quite interesting. At the beginning of this clause, we might assume, well, if sovereignty belongs to God, then perhaps the rest of the clause might say, and therefore the representatives of God on earth then carry out this sovereignty. But no, this clause says, therefore the people are to exercise this divine right directly. Now, if it were left at this, then it might be relatively easy to insist that all the important decisions in Iran should be made on the basis of elections and so on. But if we read on, the next article directly somehow qualifies the people's sovereignty. And it states, the powers of government in the Islamic Republic are vested in the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive, functioning under the supervision of the absolute Vilayat al-Faqih. The Vilayat al-Amr is the Arabic term, Vilayat al-Faqih is the one that's more often used in the Persian parlance, and the leadership of the Ummah in accordance with the forthcoming articles of the Constitution. So the highest theological authority is supervising the three branches of power. We find further manifestation of this tension between two different notions of sovereignty in the Constitution. So on the one hand, Article 113 says, after the leadership, so this is the supreme leader, the theological leader, the president is the highest official in the country. He has the responsibility to implement the Constitution and to act as a head of the executive, but then, very important to note, except in matters directly concerned with the leadership. Of course, this is not qualified anywhere else. So the leader can rather easily try to take certain mandates and competencies from the president by referring to Article 113 and insisting that these matters are rather of direct concern for the leadership. And then, on the other hand, Article 107 says the leader is equal with the rest of the people in front of the law. But I will show you in a moment how this again is curtailed, because the leader, in effect, appoints the head of the judiciary, and together with the head of the judiciary, who appoints all the leading judges in the country. It's very difficult to still regard him as equal before the law if he's the one who makes the most important appointments in the judiciary. And apart from that, he also appoints a number of other key political institutions. So how does this play out if we try to sort of take a look at how political decisions are being made in the Islamic Republic? Well, you have this tension between popular sovereignty and divine sovereignty represented in the institutions of the country, in the sense that, yes, we have direct elections of the president, we have direct elections of the parliament, we have direct elections also of all the municipal governments, the city council and so on, and we have direct elections of an important institution that's called the Assembly of Experts, which is a council of 83 high-ranking clerics who in turn elect the supreme leader. So this group is directly elected by the people, and they in turn elect the supreme leader who has the most high-ranking or highest-ranking political office in the country. So many look at this and argue, well, it shouldn't be so difficult to reform the republic from within, because if the electorate decides to vote into the Assembly of Experts, rather reform-minded ayatollahs, then they, of course, will in turn elect a rather reform-minded supreme leader, right? And you might have noticed that some of these reform-minded ayatollahs also have been quoted on TV this summer. Ayatollah Kadibar is someone who now lives here in the United States and teaches at Duke University and has written extensively on how one could have an Islamic regime on the one hand, but also make sure that it does cohere to democratic governance and that the civil liberties are protected and so on. So he is one of the representatives that we sometimes read of here in the newspapers. I think he was actually quoted in the New York Times article on Saturday. But there are a number of others also that are very reform-minded and would be willing to think about how a democratic regime could be established that at the same time is not entirely anti-religious or anti-clerical. Well, the problem is that all of these electoral institutions, the Assembly of Experts and the presidency and the parliament, all of these elections are closely monitored by this institution, the Guardian Council, and the Guardian Council can exclude any candidate from running for any office, right? So, so if a reform-minded, high-ranking member of the clergy puts forth his candidacy for the Assembly of Experts, then it's quite possible that the Guardian Council decides not to let him run for that council. So there's an inbuilt control mechanism that renders many of these elections less contestable than they should be, because all the candidates are pre-screened by this Guardian Council. Well, and how does this Guardian Council come together? As I mentioned a moment ago, this council is also directly and indirectly appointed by the Supreme Leader. So he can make sure that there are only members in the Guardian Council that in turn will not allow very reform-minded individuals to run in these electoral institutions. Now, he's also the head of the armed forces, the Supreme Leader is, and he also appoints the head of the judiciary. And I want to draw your attention to this council that I will speak about a little bit more in a moment, which is very interesting because the Islamic constitution was reformed once in 1989, 10 years basically after the Islamic Revolution, and after the passing of Ayatollah Khomeini, the first Supreme Leader. So after his passing, the constitution was reformed, and this council was created only at that time. And it's very interesting because the Expediency Council is basically supposed to take care that all the laws passed are also in the spirit of the common good, so to say, or the best interest of the country. And while beforehand the parliament would pass legislative proposals and then the Guardian Council would have to see whether these cohere with Islamic law and the constitution. So most reform proposals could be vetoed by the Guardian Council, and then the parliament would have to either change the draft or not pass the law in the first place. Well, that was the case until 1989. Since 1989, this council can actually step in. If the Guardian Council vetoes legislation, the Expediency Council can step in and decide to pass the law based on certain changes that it wants to undertake itself, or it can decide to pass the law as the parliament initially envisioned it, or it can decide to pass the law as the Guardian Council suggested, including the changes that the council suggested. And the reason why this is very interesting is that this council is also, as you may imagine, entirely appointed by the supreme leader. But what's very interesting about this council, if one thinks about the theocratic character of the state, is all the members of this council do not necessarily need to be clerics. They can be doctors, engineers. Anyone could be appointed into this council, including women. No woman has ever been appointed to this council, but it is possible to do so. Whereas the Guardian Council, of course, is entirely made up of clerics. And then if we think about what this means for legislation in the country, well, until 1989, the Guardian Council would make sure that all the laws that are suggested by the Parliament are actually in conformity with Islamic law, right? And now, since the Expediency Council has been established, it may decide to disregard the changes that are suggested by the Guardian Council and may pass the laws just with reference to expediency. There's nothing necessarily religious about this anymore, right? It may decide to pass, for example, a privatization law, as happened also in the mid-90s, that really has nothing to do with Islamic economic policy, Islamic banking. It was purely conceived to be in the best interest of economic development in the country to pass this privatization law, and the Guardian Council couldn't do much about it. So if we think about what that means for preserving, or rather than transforming, the theocratic character of this Islamic Republic, it's very interesting to see that in some ways, I would argue, secular or not necessarily clerical individuals are replacing in the power that they have, in the manner that they have, the clerical decision makers. Okay, so let me just check how much time. Well, maybe another 10 minutes. Would that be okay? Or yes? Okay. So I will. Yes, I will just talk a little bit about this highest office, the supreme leadership. As I mentioned, it did undergo some crisis after 1989, after Ayatollah Khomeini passed away, because his successor is by no means a leading religious authority. So theoretically speaking, the highest political office is also supposed to be staffed by the highest theological authority in the country, and many will argue that even for Khomeini that was the case, because there were also other high-ranking grand ayatollahs during the revolution that by no means were less qualified than Khomeini. And what happened during the early years of the revolution is that by putting them under house arrest and also by virtue of the fact that Islamic factions, I don't want to say that they were commissioned by Khomeini or not, we don't really know that, but by virtue of the fact that Islamic factions assassinated some of these grand ayatollahs, Khomeini emerged as the most politically powerful among these grand ayatollahs in 1979. So even for him, we wouldn't argue retrospectively that he was the most high-ranking ayatollah at that time. But certainly, his successor in 1989, Khamenei, lacks all the necessary theological credentials that are supposed to go into this office. And that has required another change in the constitution in 1989 to the extent that the clause was reformulated. Beforehand, the clause simply stated that the Wali al-Faqih, the supreme jurist, should be the highest theological authority in the country. But then one added some clauses to this article that highlighted that he should also have, experience in political matters. If you look at Clause 2, in case of multiplicity of persons fulfilling the above qualifications and conditions, the person possessing the better jurisprudential and political perspicacity, very unusual word, will be given preference. And in the clause just above that, right political and social perspicacity, prudence, courage, administrative facilities, and adequate capability of leadership. So I'm just showing that to you in order to highlight that the Constitution was also changed in order already to highlight that perhaps this will not be the highest theological authority in the country, but at least he should also have experience in political and administrative matters and so on. So Khamenei, I don't know to how many of you this will say anything. A Hujjatul Islam is a little bit lower ranking than an Ayatollah. Khamenei, the current supreme leader, was only Hujjatul Islam at that time. And many actually argue that even until today he hasn't written anything that would qualify him to be an Ayatollah. And what he did is commissioned some translations of another Ayatollah who had published widely on questions of law in Arabic and translated this into Persian and somehow trying to present this as his own writings to qualify him as an Ayatollah, but many sort of saw through this, and that's one of the reasons why he still faces a lot of contestation, even from among the clerical establishment of those who don't regard him to be a leading theological authority at all. So we see that the regime has transformed in some interesting ways. It hasn't become more democratic or even more competitive within, but it certainly, I would say, has seen a secularization in the way that law is created, and also some change in the way in which the highest political authority is being conceptualized. Now, this council, this expediency council that I showed you a moment ago, is called in Persian the Majlis Maslahat. Maslahat is actually not at all a Shi'i theological principle. It's a principle that only belongs into Sunni jurisprudence and has been used among Sunni legal experts really since the 9th century in order to be able to renew the law, renew Islamic law, and adapt it always to the conditions of the time by referring to maslahat, by referring to expediency. And the Shias did not believe in this principle for the better part of 12 centuries, or 13 centuries, one could say. But 10 years into the Islamic Republic, one suddenly sees that the Shi'i jurists recognize the virtue of maslahat in order to be able to justify the renovation of Islamic law. So it's something that is really quite a revolution, theologically speaking, not just politically, in the tradition of Shiism. So this council was established, the Maslahat Council, and something that we see in the 1990s and early 2000s is that it grows, not just in terms of who is on this council, but also in terms of what it can do. And I just mentioned to you a moment ago what it can do today. It can even sort of overrule the Guardian Council when the Guardian Council decides that certain law doesn't adhere to Islamic principles. It can overrule that council and say, well, you know, with reference to expediency, or it's in the best interest of the country to pass this particular law, and even if it doesn't agree with Islamic law, it doesn't really matter because we have to take the best interest of the people into consideration. That doesn't mean that, again, that it's necessarily a more liberal or democratic legislation that is passed, because even with reference to the interest of the country, one, of course, can easily pass a rather authoritarian measures. What it means is that those that are responsible for lawmaking are increasingly not clerics, but non-clerical authorities. So, one more thing that I will highlight to you is the fact that clerics, and as I just argued, clerics are no longer that involved in lawmaking, but they also have been marginalized from other positions. And I'm not trying to argue that clerics are less important today in the Islamic Republic than they were in the 1980s or even early 1990s, but rather it means that the power has been centralized in the Supreme Leader's office, and he basically puts in charge those people that are most in accordance with his preferences. So we see that he has enlarged this expediency council. Initially, it had 13 members, then 27, then 33, then 44. It is sort of a measure of cooptation, if you will. I'm sure you have seen these mechanisms quite often if you look at other authoritarian regimes, how political decision makers bring into a ruling coalition through cooptation new individuals that might otherwise go into the opposition. That's something that we see here in the case of this council. But we also find, interestingly enough, that less and less people vote for clerics in the parliamentary elections. So these are the composition of clerics as percentage of the parliamentarian deputies. The first Majlis stands here for the parliament, 1980 to 84, then the second 84 to 88. Then you can go further in 4-year steps. The sixth Majlis was 2000 to 2004, and then a very, very light decrease again in 2004 from 12 to 15% of clerics that are, in terms of membership in parliament. This coincides with a slightly conservative turn, if you will, in 2004, before Ahmadinejad was then elected a year later. So we see that there's a quite dramatic decline in terms of clerics that are elected to parliament, which I think reflects the preferences of the voters in terms of thinking that, well, it's much more important to vote for those that have the expertise in certain areas, be it finance, economics, whatever it may be, than that they're clerically trained, because that often means that they are more driven by ideological considerations when passing laws than by expertise. So through these through the decrees of clerics in the parliament, and also through this establishment of the Expediency Council, I would argue that one sees a lower sort of involvement of clerics that might not necessarily agree with the office of the supreme leader in these institutions. And one also sees that certain clerics are being marginalized through another institution. This is the final institution that I will highlight to you, which I personally find very, very interesting, which is the special courts of the clergy. And so we have 4 types of courts in Iran. The general courts are courts that you would find in every country that take care of criminal and civil cases, also military courts. But then you have 2 unconstitutional courts that were established in the early years of the revolution and were never dissolved, or when they were dissolved, they were re-established very shortly thereafter. So one is the Islamic revolutionary courts, and if you might have seen again on TV this summer these show trials, right? Because 100 opposition figures were shown in the show trials after the demonstrations this summer. Many of them are university professors, engineers, intellectuals, who are accused of sort of fostering a velvet revolution in Iran and having ties to the Brookings Institution and also a certain project at Harvard, as well as the British Foreign Office. There are a number of very different institutions that are grouped together in this indictment of having tried to foster a velvet revolution in Iran. All of those individuals that you may have seen there in these show trials are tried in this revolutionary court. And that's the most important court to try dissidents, journalists, and so on. But then there's also the special cause of the clergy, which is only instituted really to keep control over members in the clergy that are not in conformity, or whose writings and thought and so on is not in conformity with the supreme leader. And this court has been, was established early in the revolution, and there are a number of gruesome reports of how, as I hinted at a moment ago, other high-ranking ayatollahs were sort of marginalized and neutralized, quote-unquote, by Khomeini or other actors in order to establish Khomeini as the leading ayatollah in the country. And these courts have been in operation since, and actually have sort of increased their activity after Khamenei succeeded Khomeini. And that's perhaps not so surprising if we keep in mind that Khamenei's theological authority is so much contested, and that other high-ranking ayatollahs can easily write and publish things that may prove the extent to which he is not really a high-ranking theological authority. And one can easily see why the supreme leader would want to use these courts in order to put such ayatollahs under house arrest, to make sure that they no longer teach in the Islamic seminaries, and to censor their publications and so on. And this court, of course, you can't find in any other country, as far as I'm aware of, even in Saudi Arabia or Sudan, countries that also have theocratic elements. There is no such institution that keeps such a close check on dissension from within the clerical circles. So I'll skip over the independence of the judiciary. I hinted at this before, just to give you a sense of what these special clerical courts do. They strip as many as 150 members of the clergy of their religious titles per year, which means that they may no longer wear the garb, may no longer teach, and may no longer call themselves Hujjat al-Islam or Ayatollah. And they punish an additional 200 for other offenses every year. We know of a number of executions that have taken place because even the death penalty may be issued in these courts. But it's always very difficult to look through sort of the details of these court cases, because very often such authorities will be accused of adultery or other sort of moral crimes when one can only assume, but it's very difficult to sort of substantiate this from outside the country, when one can only assume that probably there were theological reasons rather than moral crimes that stand behind these harsh verdicts. So we look at the past 30 years of the Islamic Republic and see that the regime has transformed quite dramatically. And that is rather fascinating, I think personally, because it is a regime that is very different in terms of its makeup, by virtue of the fact that it is based on a revolution, that many people who don't agree with the current government will still say, well, I fought in the revolution, I believe in this revolution, I believe the current government has alienated the values that we fought for, but we certainly don't believe that the revolution failed. You find that attitude is still quite widespread, and so it's a very different dynamic from what you would see in, I think, Egypt, where it's clear that many would believe Mubarak as someone who is a political authority, mostly sort of supported from outside of the country, and a regime that lacks heavily in legitimacy. One can't really say the same thing for Iran. One can say that the current government in Iran lacks legitimacy, and certainly so after the summer and the demonstrations and the dramatic human rights abuses that were then proven in the media after that. But one can't say that the revolutionary regime as such lacks legitimacy. I think many people still believe strongly in the revolution and want to see sort of a liberalization really still from within these parameters. Not from within the constitutional parameters that I tried to show you. That was the project of the reformists in the late 90s of President Khatami and his reformist factions in parliament, but still within the framework of this revolution, still believing in Islamic character of the polity, in the fact that social justice is something that has to be taken very seriously by the government, and also that is something uniquely Iranian, that is sort of a unique Iranian product, quite different from Western political regimes. I think that is still, in many ways, the challenge. So even though one sees a lot of opposition and dissent, that doesn't necessarily translate into support for a liberal democratic type of government. So to close this, I would certainly argue that increasingly this pro forma democracy resembles autocratic regimes, secular autocratic regimes, in the sense that these theocratic elements have undergone crisis in Iran, as I tried to show, that legislation no longer really needs to strictly adhere to Islamic principles, and also that the notion of Islamic authority has been undergoing crisis with these lacking credentials of the supreme leader, that through the establishment of this additional council, the Expediency Council, that may overrule the Guardian Council, legislation has secularized, and also that one finds, if we look at this data from the elections for the parliament, less and less support to vote clerics into the majlis. Now, one can argue, and this will bring us back to the point that I made at the beginning of the talk, that law plays a particular role here. That's the reason why I've placed so much emphasis here on law and showed you different articles of the Constitution, in the sense that because it's a revolutionary regime, the government can't really afford to have as established a bureaucracy of suppression as you find in Syria, for example. So whereas there you would have surveillance through these, what are they called, informants, I suppose one could say, to the government that will spy on each other in political institutions, in the media, and social institutions, sometimes, of course, even in the family. While you have that in other authoritarian regimes, in Iran, that bureaucracy is much, much smaller, and it's really the law that is used by the government in order to regulate and control opposition. So you find a regime that uses law in all sorts of interesting and innovative ways, passing new laws in order to sort of close up realms of contestation in the free media, for example, in political parties, but at the same time not surveying its citizenry as much as you find in other countries of the Middle East. And that leads to this paradoxical situation that you can of course find books in Iran that speak about liberalism and democracy and so on. Most books that are passionately debated here, if we think about political liberalism by John Rawls or other books on democratic governance, you will be able to find those in Iran. You can buy those in the bookstores. Right in there, there's a contradiction. Many visitors are surprised and think, well, this is a regime that in many ways is so repressive. So how come that it has so little degree on censorship of these foreign books, for example, that you have quite open discourse and debates at the university level. Well, this pluralism is allowed because it is a revolutionary regime that I think wants to present its degree of contestation internally, but then as soon as people mobilize and demonstrate and so on and try to demand concrete political liberalization, the law sets in and the judiciary does, and puts control on these opposition activities. So we'll leave it at that for the moment. During the question and answer session, we can maybe talk a little bit more about what Iranians might believe. There's some opinion survey data that I have in terms of how much do Iranians believe in clerical government and so on. There's some evidence on that, or whatever other questions you may want to pose in response to this lecture. Thank you very much.
How will the next supreme leader be chosen?
Right. That's an excellent question. It was also hotly debated this summer in Iran because it's the assembly of experts, these 83 individuals, clerical individuals that will elect the next supreme leader. And theoretically, again, according to the constitution, this assembly of experts could also decide to replace the current supreme leader by an alternative individual. So they could have decided this summer what looks like an electoral coup is just not at all acceptable in the framework of our revolution, and therefore we might nominate an alternative individual. This didn't happen because the Assembly of Experts in many ways is sort of a lame-duck institution. It meets once a year, and it's supposed to write a report on the Supreme Leader's performance, but it really only asks the Supreme Leader for a meeting, and then his entries are exchanged and so on. It's not really the powerful institution that it could be. And just to give you an anecdote, these special courts of the clergy, it's not only that they put high-ranking ayatollahs under house arrest or close down seminaries or limit high-ranking ayatollahs from teaching what are potentially subversive ideas to students, they also often put pressure on these religious authorities by persecuting their sons. We have a number of stories that show that sons of the members of the Assembly of Experts this summer were arrested, probably in order to sort of pressure their fathers, who are members of the Assembly of Experts, not to use the power that the Assembly theoretically has in order to think about whether the Supreme Leader could be replaced by an alternative candidate.
Thank you for a very good expose of the Iranian government as it is, since it is very little understood really in the US. But I am curious if you would please comment on the fact that the Expediency Council does have ex officio members who are not directly appointed by the leader, and some of these ex officio members are actually elected. Such as the president and the head of the parliament.
That's true, yes.
Sitting head of the parliament.
That's true.
And the sitting president, they are ex-official members of that. And also the fact that the Expediency Council does not initiate legislation. Neither the Guardian Council.
Right.
None of them have the power of initiating budget or controlling budget. They can reject or propose to the leader a compromise that must be made between the Majlis and the Guardian Council.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Please
Right,
expand on that, please.
So the Expediency Council today has 44 members, and I mentioned it had expanded over a number of years. And 6 of the members of the Expediency Council are members of the Guardian Council, so those are appointed. And then there is the president that ex officio sits on this Expediency Council, and the head of the Majlis, the parliament. Those are the elected members. But out of 44, that's a tiny minority, of course. Now, the Expediency Council is activated, as I mentioned, if the Guardian Council vetoes legislation right from the Majlis, and if the Majlis decides, if the Guardian Council decides that here's a contradiction, this legislative proposal violates either Islamic law or the Constitution, then the Parliament can decide to refer this legislative proposal to the Expediency Council. And it's true, the Council cannot initiate legislation. But what's very interesting, it actually can pass its own budget. And for example, these special courts of the clergy are not under the supervision budgetary-wise of the Parliament. So all other budgets, theoretically speaking, should be passed in the Parliament, right? Just as is the case in most countries. But the budget of these special courts, and nobody really knows how large this budget is passed within the Expediency Council. And so that adds another sort of dimension of ambiguity to the powers that the Expediency Council has.
Recently, a Newsweek reporter was interviewed on television. I wonder if you could comment. He was asked, who really runs Iran?
Right, oh yeah.
And he said, the Revolutionary Guard. How would you comment on that?
Yes. Let me talk first a little bit about the president and the supreme leader, and then I will come to speak about the Revolutionary Guard. So, on the one hand, one often sees quotes and interviews of Ahmadinejad in the media, and of course he is the president of the country, but the president in Iran has actually a rather small mandate. The most important mandate of the president is economic policy. He doesn't make foreign policy, he doesn't make security policy, and as you also saw, most of the really decisive appointments in the country are beyond his purview. They are made from the office of the supreme leadership. So it is economic policy that the president is responsible for. Now Ahmadinejad has a strong background in the Revolutionary Guards. He was a member of the Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards have become, in the last 4 or 5 years, a very important economic player in the country. And this is another very interesting and unusual detail of Iran compared to other countries in the Middle East is that no economic expert will be able to tell you how much of the Iranian economy is privatized and how much is in state or parastatal hands. Most experts estimate that about 80% of the entire economy is either in the possession of the state or in the possession of parastatal companies, or in the possession of companies that are administered in so-called religious foundations that in turn are administered by the Supreme Leader's office. So the Supreme Leader will appoint all the leading administrators of these religious foundations, and they in turn often are sort of conglomerates of pistachio trade, carpet trade. The Iranian equivalent to Coca-Cola company is one of these religious foundations. And these foundations don't pay taxes, they don't have open accounts. Nobody really knows, again, these are all estimations, how many employees are employed in enterprises that are run through the religious foundations, but there are no annual reports that can actually be checked. And the Revolutionary Guards have been able to expand the extent to which state contracts have been given out. So the new airport in Iran has been mostly constructed through Revolutionary Guard subcontractors, the telecommunications network. Again, I'm not an economic expert, but many economic experts would, based on estimations rather than concrete data, argue that they're probably the most important economic actor in Iran.
In a similar vein, there was information today that the CD, is that what they're called?
Yes.
Are going into 6,000 schools, and they're going to be making sure that proper teaching takes place. Whatever. What role do they play, and who's pulling their strings? Is it coming from the Khomeini? Is it coming from the president's office? From the Because they were the ones that we saw a lot on television, beating up people on their motorcycles and people.
Yeah. The Basij are grouped under the Revolutionary Guards. They are a voluntary force. They do not have regular salaries, but they have a lot of sort of incentives in terms of the access that one gets as a Basij member to university entries, certain governmental services, subsidized housing, and so on. So there are a number of ways in which, especially for the lower economic strata, there are incentives to join the Basij on a voluntary basis because one gets access to certain goods that one otherwise would not. And it's right that they are the ones that were mostly mobilized in the suppression of these demonstrators this summer. And often use sort of the existing mosque networks to store their weaponry or the sort of the instruments, the clubs and so on that they need for the suppression of demonstrations. Those are often, ironically, today stored in the mosques. And so I have a good, one of my professors who also took part in the revolution, told me it's interesting to notice how mosques play a very different role today than they did in the 1979 revolution, because during the revolution, the mosques were in many ways the place where one would find out about the next demonstration. One would go to the service and hear from the Friday prayer leader what could be done in order to mobilize into the street. The Friday prayer leaders were the ones that heavily criticized the Shah and so on. Now, the demonstrators today lack these communication channels. Right? They obviously can't use the mosque network because that's entirely taken over by the state, and especially by the siege groups. And it's often very difficult to simply coordinate one's activities because one goes into the street and sort of tries to find out, well, where's the next demonstration taking place? There are contradictory news in the media of what's going on, and you probably also saw some of that in the YouTube videos that you did of sort of pure disorientation and confusion on the streets because an infrastructure was lacking to organize dissent that in many ways, interestingly, I think, was a function of the mosque in 1979.
A little similar to those questions. I read in the paper during the demonstrations that the president and the army were actually possibly pulling the strings, and that the supreme leader was really not as much in control as we might think.
Yes. Yes. I can only say I'm personally skeptical of that because, again, the judiciary is entirely under the purview of the supreme leader. I cannot imagine that these systematic human rights abuses take place without the knowledge of the supreme leader. For sure, it is the Revolutionary Guard that logistically deal with the demonstrations and decide to which prisons and so on to bring which opposition figures. But I'm usually skeptical of sort of accounts that present the supreme leader as someone not being informed or outside or beyond responsibility for these activities, because after all, his office is the most important one in appointing all the key figures. And theoretically speaking, yes, he's supposed to just have a supervisory role over the three branches of power, but on the other hand, he's deeply involved. And I tend to think that he knows exactly what is going on. Now, in some ways, he sort of tried to, I think, take a step back when he came out in this famous Friday prayer that he gave about 2 weeks after the uprising or after the demonstrations. He later closed Rakhriza prison, right, which is one in the south of Tehran, which became sort of notorious for disappearances and murders that probably have taken place there. So he's the one who ordered the closure of this facility. And some media presented him as sort of undertaking a corrective step against abuses that had been committed by the Revolutionary Guards, as if he hadn't known about it, became aware of it, and then tried to correct it. And that is absolutely possible. I'm just personally about, from what I know about the Supreme Leader's office and having looked at its policy with regard to the special codes of the clergy and so on, I tend to think that he's perfectly aware of what's happening. And is not sort of beyond that responsibility.
This morning it was also reported that it seems the Revolutionary Guard is getting more involved in the media, the internet, telecommunications within Iran. I'm curious as to, it sounded like the Chinization of Iran in a way, the way the Chinese government, which is obviously not a theocracy, is trying to kind of keep control over its population. I'm curious as to who are the outside influences do you think Iran works with that are either Islamic in nature or not to try to help maintain their control over their population?
Well, again, so rumors had it this summer that a former KGB specialist trained part of the Revolutionary Guards and helped just very clearly in terms of the logistics of how to deal with these demonstrations. And I'm not aware of any cooperation with other Islamic countries, interestingly enough. So it's mostly Russia that seems to be involved in this. Yes.
Where does science, and particularly nuclear science, fit into this whole structure? Is it considered economic development with the president, or how does or is it military? Where does that get managed?
Yes, that's a very complex question. Professor von Hibbel, who also teaches here as a physicist, he argues that it makes no economic sense whatsoever for Iran to engage in to target a nuclear what is the right word? Not nuclear. The possibility to construct a nuclear warhead that makes no economic sense whatsoever. Ahmadinejad, for him, is a nationalist issue beyond anything else. It is an issue of deterrence. It is an issue of trying to show the rest of the world that yes, Iran has the means, the technological development to engage in the development of nuclear warhead. And of course, the IAEA, the last IAEA report, already wasn't in late September. It's already some time ago. Showed that by February, Iran might be able to construct a nuclear warhead, right? So it's not that far away. And now with the nuclear agreement that I don't think will come about, by virtue of the fact that the Iranian leadership has until now not agreed to enrichment outside of its territory, it seems that it will pursue this role for the time being. It is mostly a nationalist issue. I think most political, not most, but I would say many political observers would argue that Iran does not, will not use a nuclear warhead if it will be able to, and that similar to India and Pakistan, it is a matter of deterrence. But of course, one never knows. One also certainly doesn't know how this regime will evolve, and I would say that it is more stable today than it was even a year ago, despite all this unrest. But the supreme leader still has a very good grip on the government, and one doesn't know what might happen if new political leaders from the Revolutionary Guards emerge as more important political decision makers, and what they might do then with that type of weaponry. So, yeah, not a very positive prospect.
I was going to say, you said the people who were basically did not want to be a democracy. I mean, they're happy with the structure they have. Are the people? Do you think people are they satisfied with the way their government's going?
Well, many are not satisfied, and many, of course, have economic grievances primarily. And I would also say, having studied democracies in comparative perspective, of course, it is open economic grievances that come first before demands for political liberalization and civil liberties and so on, right? I was recounting earlier, I studied in East Germany because I was very interested to see the attitudes of East Germans towards the newly gained liberties that many enjoyed after reunification. And I had to realize as a young student that it was really, I think, economic matters that pushed most, and the political rights were secondary to many. Now, I wouldn't want to argue that those who support political liberalization are not also pro-democratic. And The point here is that a potentially democratic Iran, whenever that may come about, whether it's in 10, 15, or 20 years, does not necessarily need to be strictly secular in the sense that one doesn't need to have a strict separation between religion and state. That's not so unusual, right? Because in this country, of course, we have the wall of separation, or one believes in the wall of separation, but in many European states you have church tax, you have religious instruction in public schools, you have, for example, in Germany, an ethics council that gives counsel to the parliament. It doesn't have veto power, of course, but there are religious representatives in this council, also scientists, who are consulted by the parliament on certain ethical issues. And so that is, of course, there are a number of mechanisms that one can envision in which clerical authorities could still play a role in Iran without having veto power, and without the fact that any of these political positions would be reserved for clerical authorities. We just had the Middle Eastern Studies Association at its annual conference 3 days ago. We actually had a panel on with Mohsen Khadivar, who I mentioned earlier, who's one of these, I would call them dissident ayatollahs. And he argued that, yes, his vision is a pro-democratic vision, but not an anti-clerical vision, and not an anti-religious vision, right? It's a vision of a country where religiosity is taken seriously, where perhaps also through the instruction of religion in public schools, the state supports religiosity among the people, but at the same time where the government is purely secular, where it doesn't matter whether you're a clerical or non-clerical personality in terms of what positions one can run for and so on. So he envisioned sort of an Iran with separation of powers and checks and balances, but where many mechanisms are nevertheless in place that allow a government to, I guess, promote religiosity. And I think that sentiment may be shared by many who believe such a system could be in the spirit of the revolution, actually. It would be radically different from the current government, and it would not be able to arrive at that based on the current constitution. But for many, I think this could still resemble what they think the revolution, the norms that the revolution stood for.
Can the Iranian people leave when they want to? I mean, can they travel? Are they free to travel, pretty much?
Male adults are, yes. Of course, if one gets a visa, right? It's always a question whether one can get a visa to travel to Turkey. Iranians still need visas for Turkey, but for most countries, they of course do need visas. And women usually need either the permission of the father or the husband to travel.
I think that might be a good way to conclude this